BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Friday, another Anything Goes Friday. Welcome to the show. Just a couple of quick announcements and reminders before we begin. The first one is that on the weekends there is now a regular show about JonBenet Ramsey, and Wednesdays have now been devoted to Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. The episode that you're going to hear today is one that I've been meaning to do for a while. I have to give a shout out to longtime BBOR listener Batman66, who sent a message into the Facebook page. My personal Facebook is in the description box, asking me if I would talk about the book The Flat Tire Murders by Michael P. Burns. And I, of course, stated that I've done one episode on his book in the past, specifically on the chapter devoted to the Miami Strangler. The Flat Tire Murders by Michael P. Burns covers several different true crime stories from the state of Florida, but it was the Miami Strangler story that stood out to me the most. And the final victim of the Miami Strangler is just a possible victim, and her name is Clara Amelie. And I've been meaning to do a larger episode that has been devoted to her story and looking at some of the similarities and the differences. And I did the episode on the Miami Strangler about a year and a half ago, so I also had to get a big refresher. And I just get those moments when I want to remember things simply because I am curious about them. I remember my initial sense of curiosity that I had about this case and trying to just understand this part of human behavior that a lot of people are simply terrified of. And if you would like to propose any ideas for future episodes, you can do it the same way Batman66 did. Send it into the Facebook page. You can also get me at my email address, BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. Also, ideas you have about JonBenet Ramsey, Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac Killer, those can be morphed into the ongoing series. And a great way to support all of these efforts is to go over to BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88. There's a link to that in the description box. That allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Mondays. Now, when I first read about the Miami Strangler, I was really quite surprised because the Miami Strangler is an unidentified serial killer who operated in Florida in the 1960s and early 70s. However, I began using the term serial killer legend to describe this type of behavior. More or less, a series of homicides took place, and they could be connected, or they could simply just be unrelated murders, and it seems very unclear if all of these crimes have been committed by the same person. To be precise, 9 to 11 murders have been attributed to the Miami Strangler in the most unofficial sources. I mean, it's an unidentified serial killer mystery, so if we don't know who the perpetrator is, there could always be unforeseen assailants or variables that would be affecting any type of particular theory. But there are so many differences in the way in which the crimes were committed, and the first thing I did was I listened back to my original episode, as well as going through the writings of Michael P. Burns and my copy of the Flat Tire Murders. And the Miami Strangler is a serial killer who targeted women exclusively, but of all types of age ranges. The youngest victim was 21 years old, and the oldest victim was 84 years old, primarily either Caucasian or Hispanic females, but one of the victims was African American. Clara Amelie, whom I will be discussing in this episode, was 25 years old at the time, which I think is not consistent with the majority of the Miami Stranglers victims, who were in their senior years, over the age of 50, over the age of 55 plus. And I do mean senior. I mean, we're talking about ages 60 to 84. So there are a lot of differences and inconsistencies in the pattern of behavior. There are also very, very intricate differences, such as one victim had a pair of panties shoved in her mouth and others did not. One victim was found inside the trunk of a car and the other victims were not. And I'm going to be very honest with you. When I was reading The Flat Tire Murders, I thought, no, this is not the same serial killer who committed all 11 murders. And I guess I'm now taking a step back from just my gut instinct, and I'm trying to think with my brain instead of my gut and saying, okay, I don't know what happened. But with the murder of Clara Amelie, I'm going to read some things to you guys, and we'll see what we can deduce. First, I would like to start out with an introduction that has actually been shared on Wikipedia, but most of it is coming from the text of the book The Flat Tire Murders by Michael P. Burns. The perpetrator, known as the Miami Strangler, may also be responsible for the murder of Clara Jane Amelie, who was strangled to death in her home on September 12, 1971. On the afternoon before her murder, Armaly was last seen by her estranged husband, who came to pick up their children for a visit. Armaly's body was found face down in her bedroom by her husband on the morning of September 13th. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, nor were there any signs of a struggle between Armaly and the perpetrator. Additionally, an electrical cord was found near her bed, but it's unknown if the cord was used to strangle her. Armaly's husband went into a state of shock after finding her remains and had to be sedated at the hospital. To date, no arrests have been made in Clara Amelie's murder. And if you were to look up her story on Google, you would find some very similar statements that have been written paraphrasing that. And as I said, I believe a lot of that is coming from Michael P. Burns. However, based on some of the other things that have been shared about the Miami Strangler, some of the victims were strangled, others were also smothered with a pillow. But a key hallmark of the Miami Strangler's activities was that he or they would remove some of the victim's clothing, particularly pulling a shirt up to expose the breasts of a woman. This did not happen with the case of Clara Amelie, because her clothes were stripped off completely. She was found naked, and with other victims in the Miami Strangler case, one of them was just beaten severely with blunt force, and with Clara Amelie, she was not beaten at all. You heard very, very directly there. No signs of a struggle and no signs of forced entry. And I would actually like to read her obituary here. Former Warren resident found strangled. A 25-year-old former resident of Warren County was found strangled Monday morning in her home in Miami, Florida. The body of Clara Jane Armaly, the formerly known as Clara Jane Bush, was discovered at 8 a.m. on Monday by her husband, Anthony Armaly, lying face down in the bedroom of their home, according to Dade County, Florida police. Police said Armaly required treatment at a Miami hospital for shock. A Dade County coroner ruled that Mrs. Armaly had been strangled. The death was believed to have occurred on Sunday. The body of Mrs. Armaly, a native of Warren County, will be shipped to J.C. Kirby Funeral Chapel, where the rosary will be recited at 7:30 p.m. Thursday. Funeral mass will be conducted at 10 a.m. In addition to her husband, Mrs. Armaly is survived by one daughter, Meredith Armaly, of Miami, and her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Charles T. Bush, of Route 5, and one brother, Sam Bush, of Louisville, three sisters, and Miss Dorothy Jean Bush, of Route 5 as well, and a grandmother, Mrs. Susie Bush, also of Route 5. So rest in peace to Clara, of course. But when we're looking at these types of true crime cases, what some people plan to do is they take a series of homicides and they try to link them together through pattern seeking. They have a set of information in front of them, and they try to connect the dots in a way that makes sense to them. And some people would just simply say, well, lots of women were strangled from 1964 to 1971 in Miami. Therefore, there's a serial killer on the loose. But what could be an alternative? And that could be just that from time to time, there are high concentrations of homicides that take place. I mean, sometimes you would have more murderers operating in an urban city center, such as Miami, Florida, than other times. And these crimes may appear to be similar, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are connected. I just thought that Clara's case was so different than that of the other Miami Strangler victims. Firstly, she was stripped nude, no signs of force being used, whereas the other Miami Strangler victims were dealt with in a very aggressive manner. And I don't know anything about Clara's personal life. I wasn't even born in 1971. But based on the fact that there were no signs of forced entry, and there was no sign of a struggle that was put up against the attacker, that tells to me that there's a high possibility that she let the person into her home willingly. And I don't want to speculate on anything other than that, but, I mean, does that not suggest that there was a man that she let into her home willingly, and for some reason, something angered him to the point where he decided to attack her, and most likely he strangled her with the electrical cord that was found very close to the bed, although, I mean, that was determined to be inconclusive, but she was strangled and the cord is right there. I mean, you can put two and two together, but anything is possible. But that also doesn't necessarily have to be purely consistent with serial killer behavior, and that also doesn't mean, based on that fact alone, that it's the same serial killer who was responsible for murdering women in the 1960s in Miami, Florida. Not to mention the fact that strangulation can be a very intimate form of murder. And when I use the word intimate, I'm talking about somebody is trying to invade someone's intimate space. They want to be up close and personal with the victim while they're trying to commit the crime. And some of you are probably thinking, well, yeah, that's obvious. I mean, of course, if someone's going to be up close and personal if they're strangling them, right? Not exactly, because not all serial killers do that. A prime example of this would be the Zodiac killer who committed many crimes, or so, let's say a few crimes. The Zodiac killer committed a few crimes by gun from a distance without any personal contact with the victims, and definitely not strangling any of them, because there's a lack of intimacy and a lack of personal connection to the victims. So I think, anyway. But with somebody such as the Miami Strangler or the murderer of Clara Amelie, I'm noticing that this person most likely had some familiarity with her, and the fact that she was left naked shows also that this person wanted to almost have some type of pervy reward in his own mind, murdering her and stripping her naked. But these things happen very, very frequently during sexually motivated crimes where the victim is not necessarily raped. And I think that some other examples of this that I would like to provide would be the murder of Carolyn Eaton from 1982, who is a possible Zodiac killer victim. Some people believe that she was murdered by a man named Royal Russell Long, a trucker, but that's the ongoing theory that the authorities have, that she was asphyxiated in the back of a truck in Arizona. For years she was known as Valentine Sally, but they believe that she was with a man, and some type of dispute happened, and he smothered her with a pillow, actually, because her hyoid bone wasn't broken. Man and a woman together, dispute kicks off, and the person wants to either exact some type of personal revenge or have power over the victim, or gain control of the situation, punishing the woman for some type of reason. And it might not even be any fault of her own. It might be because he's mad at his mother or something like that, something in that type of psychological category. But I think all of those elements would be present in the murder of Clara Armaly. because all of the same factors are in place. She was strangled, she was stripped naked, but she was not beaten. It shows that the direct intent of this killer was to have her murdered. And I was talking about Richard Speck last week on the Anything Goes Friday segment. Richard Speck was the man responsible for the South Chicago massacre, and something that he also did to some of the victims, he murdered 8 student nurses in 1966 on one night, though. Like, again, as opposed to being a serial killer, that was an act of mass murder, and several of the victims were indeed strangled, and he's trying to unleash rage, punish them. But when Richard Speck was interviewed about that in prison, he was asked, what did you feel when you were committing the crime? And he said, the same thing I've always felt, nothing. So I think that that is pure psychopathy, or a psychopathic or sociopathic tendency. And based on the way that the murder of Clara Armaly has been committed, I think that her killer most likely was of a similar mindset. Someone who, even if they weren't a clinical sociopath, had very strong sociopathic tendencies to murder a woman for the sake of murder and just to have power over her and to punish her because of some type of deep hatred for women. And this is purely my assessment of things. I could be wrong, but I think the evidence is pointing toward that particular direction. And because I did one previous episode on the Miami Strangler, I would like to look at some comments that you guys left on YouTube. And again, please put your ideas in the comments section down below. If you have anything that you would like to share, I am totally willing to listen, and maybe your comments will be featured in a future episode of Black Box Online Radio. To be very clear, these comments are directed toward the entirety of the Miami Strangler mystery. And the first one comes to us from William Bloodworth, who says, "Excellent podcast. I hadn't heard of this killer. It's possible that some of the murders were unrelated, but it's not uncommon for killers to prey on different kinds of people. For example, BTK. Interesting." Absolutely. BTK, Dennis Rader, was a serial killer who preyed on multiple types of people. He was responsible for a crime I was talking about recently, which was the quadruple homicide of the Otero family. And, he murdered men, women, children, and you see that very clearly because the whole family was massacred, that he was not someone who was a serial killer. What I'm trying to say is some type of serial killers will not prey on children. Some of them only operate within their sexual orientation. If they're a heterosexual male, they will only target women. BTK was not like that. And I have to look at the other side of the coin, and that is providing some counterbalance here. That, let's say hypothetically, there was a serial killer in Florida, and this same person committed all 11 murders from 1964 to 71, including the murder of Clara Amelie. Well, what would be the explanation for all of these differences? One of them is that he simply didn't have to follow a rule book, and based on all of these inconsistencies, this is a killer who is targeting women, but women of all ages. The youngest victim's 21, the oldest victim's 84, Clara was 25. He's just targeting women. Age, race, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was that they were female. And I said it would provide some counterbalance, but one of the reasons why I also do not think Clara Amelie was murdered by the Miami Strangler is that her body was found a substantial distance away from the city center, and most of the victims were concentrated in the city center. But the alternative that has been provided, and even discussed in the book The Flat Tire Murders, is, could this serial killer have simply just moved to another location? From 1974 to 71, and somebody can live in one geographic area for 6 years, and then in 1971 they moved to a different part of the city, or they moved to the suburbs, and that is ultimately the counterbalance that I wanted to talk about. Sometimes people move to a different house or move to a different apartment, or they get a job in a different part of the state over a 7-year time span. I've definitely moved within the last 7 years. So you can interpret that type of behavior in a couple different ways. Now, here's a comment from SuperStrike9 who says, to answer your question about the differences in the serial killer's behavior, Richard Ramirez was a serial killer whose victims had a range of different ages, so it's definitely possible. Richard Ramirez is another serial killer that I've talked about on this channel before. I've done at least one full episode dedicated to him, as well as also mentioning him in some of the older AMAs, talking about comparing Richard Ramirez to the Zodiac Killer. And you guys know that I think Richard Ramirez was not a psychological mystery. He was just a jerk who got out of control. He was someone who burglarized people's homes and stole things so he could sell them for drugs, and his criminal behavior just escalated. Same thing with Richard Speck. It's just there are lots of jerks in the world, and some people have deviant behavior that escalates to the point of homicide. Why? Because they don't have a conscience and they're indifferent to human life. And then they do things to fuel their own excitement because their brains process neurotransmitters and neurochemicals in a particular way when they act on desire and the power of domination, because they get this type of feeling that comes from being satiated when they inflict pain on another person, and they don't feel any type of grief or remorse or empathy for the person they're torturing. They're simply using other people to fuel their own excitement, and sometimes it can even be described as rather blank. It's just that they're just showing indifference to everything, the way that Richard Speck described, but other people talk about it as a heightened form of excitement. And the first serial killer that comes to mind in that regard was Andrei Chikatilo, the Butcher of Rostov, a Russian serial killer. But here's a comment from Tyler Grover. I think I read somewhere that they thought Samuel Little got his start in the Miami area in the late 1960s or early 70s. Not sure if it's related or not, and I can't remember where I read that. And there was a follow-up from Crazy Inside Forever who said, that's true, I believe, so it's possible this Miami Strangler may have been some of his early activity. That's going to be something else that I'm going to have to explore in the future. However, with the murder of Clara Armaly, I'm still not convinced that she was killed by a serial killer. I mean, this could have just been a man who had a particular infatuation with her, or a man that saw a woman in a vulnerable position. And the fact that there is no sign of a struggle, I mean, that usually means that he was in the home voluntarily. And yes, serial killers couldn't do that, but if every woman in the Miami Strangler case had been strangled with an electrical cord, I wouldn't be saying this. If every woman had been left face down naked, I wouldn't be saying this. I'd be like, yeah, okay, that's the same serial killer's pattern. But from reading these comments here from you guys, I think you can tell by now that all of us are in somewhat of an agreement that serial killers do not always operate with a pattern. I mean, you guys have brought up some great examples. BTK, Richard Ramirez, and possibly the Miami Strangler. I also talked about the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac didn't have much of a pattern, definitely not a consistent one. So there is just this conception out there that serial killers only operate in the same way, that they only target one type of victim, they only commit the crimes using one method. And even if Clara Amelie was not killed by the Miami Strangler and the other 9 or 10 victims were, not all those victims were killed in the same way. I told you very clearly, some were strangled and some were asphyxiated, and at least one of them was beaten with a blunt object. Cat Chevy says, Ned, here's the first thing that popped into my mind when you spoke of the middle-aged women between age 40 and 60 with exposing their breasts. Mother, the killer's younger years. Then in the 80-year-old, his mom is older, still listening, so I don't know how this ends, but that really stuck out to me, exposing her breasts. What is more maternal than what feeds a baby? And, that could be a very, very good observation by Cat Chevy. I almost called you Classic Chevy Cat. That's always how I know you. But, I mean, doesn't that not make sense to you? I mean, this isn't like some type of mind-reading exercise. This is just, doesn't that make sense that if the Miami Strangler were targeting women and he's pulling up their shirts or their dress to reveal their breasts, that's trying to do something in a maternal way? And it could be just that he's trying to do something perverted and just look at her. But, I mean, I think that Cat Chevy might be onto something, that comes from a hatred of this person's mother, and he wanted to dominate these women because of some deep maternal hatred. However, that type of gesture did not take place with the murder of Clara Armaly. So I'm beginning to think that that's a different perpetrator, and the fact that she is just left naked and face down, and most likely strangled with the electrical cord, simply says that that was a sexually motivated crime that didn't end in a bludgeoning and violent assault, but somebody wanted to gain power over her for some type of sexual response, no matter what, no matter what. A lot of these serial killers are sexually motivated, even if rape or other forms of sexual assault are not taking place, whether it is or it isn't. I mean, you look at a serial killer like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. I mean, he's mailing bombs, he's sending them. He's not even having any physical contact with the victims, and almost certainly he was a sexually motivated serial killer because of the type of feeling that he got. They think Kaczynski even had some type of sexual release from building the bombs. He would assemble them and then take them apart and build them up again, and it would take him 100 hours to build a bomb that would only take 9 hours to make, because he got some type of sexual pleasure from creating these death machines. I wish I hadn't said that exact phrase, but that's what it is. There's sexual motivation without physical contact. And I think with the murderer of Clara Armaly, this person is definitely trying to dominate her for a sexual reason, no matter what. No matter who the perpetrator was, Miami Strangler, unknown serial killer or not, or maybe it was just the creep down the street who asked if he could come in because he was trying to do some type of test on the water and inspect some part of her home, passing himself off with the lamest excuse in the world, and then he attacked her because he thought he could get away with it. And the sad fact is that no matter who committed the murder of Clara Armaly, they did get away with it. And that's the long and short of it. This is an unsolved murder case, and there are not too many suspects in the Miami Strangler mystery. There is one that is named Calvin Jones Jr., who is someone who is a suspect in multiple crimes, not the murder of Clara Armaly, but, you know, I'm just going to go out and say that thing that I didn't want to say purely for the sake of discussion. I mean, absolutely no disrespect to the victim. But is it possible at all that there was some type of secret man in her life? I don't even want to insinuate that she was having an affair because I feel somewhat guilty about that, but I mean, a secret man doesn't even have to be an affair. It could be just she had a male acquaintance that wanted to be with her and he could not, so he decided to act his revenge. I mean, I think all of those things are consistent with Clara's murder, and I think Cat Chevy, I keep trying to call you Classic Chevy Cat Black, um, hit the nail on the head when she said that the Miami Strangler is pulling up the shirt to expose the breasts of the women because he hates his mother. With the other person, I mean, to be very direct, it feels like some type of sexually denied perpetrator. But that's just my take on the subject. What do you think about the murder of Clara Armaly? What do you think about the psychological profile of her killer, or with any of the other true crime cases that I've talked about? And I'm very glad that you guys decided to respond to the Miami Strangler episode. Again, that came out about a year and a half ago. This episode has been long overdue, but I'm glad that you're comparing and contrasting the different behavior of certain serial killers to the story that's being discussed. BTK, Richard Ramirez, Samuel Little, all of these different perpetrators, because we can learn more about the human experience when we lay out everything. And when someone's going to tell you, no, serial killers don't operate that way, it's so easy to say, oh, yes, they do, and here's a whole list of examples. So please put your ideas in the comment section down below. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And BlackBoxNet88 on BuyMeACoffee.com. There's a link to that in the description box down below. Many links to check out and visit. Amazon.com. for the books written by me, as well as BlackBoxOnlineRadio on Instagram for the bonus podcast, and I will see you over there. Until next time.